Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the closing plenary. I think my job as moderator today is to, with the help of four fellow revolutionaries, I hope, on this podium, blow any holes there might still be in the complacency of Europe's okay. We really want to be as challenging as possible about what, in the light of the events of the last few days here in Europe, what is working and what isn't, and what are the really tough challenges Europe needs to face to get back to growth. And in that sense, I want to see if we can start picking up some of the themes I've heard uttered by many of you in the conversations and corridors, where you don't buy the idea that Europe will just sort of weather this crisis. It was like a bad cold and business will be back to how it was before. I think many of you have been saying this is a pretty major thing, and it's got long-term consequences. And I want to try and get at some of that in this closing plenary. We've got just the right people to help us do it. From the left, if I can, or from my right, rather, your left, if I can introduce Bozidar Djelic, the Deputy Prime Minister for European Integration and Minister of Science and Technology Development of Serbia, and a young global leader.
6 more months.
6 more months.
For 6 more months, yeah.
6 more months. So still a youth voice for 6 more months.
I've been explaining I moved from young global leader to middle-aged in one day. So that's okay.
Valdis Dombrovskis, the Prime Minister of Latvia. Dalia, Grybauskaite, the President of Lithuania, Vincent van Quickenborne, the Minister of Economy and Reform of Belgium. So we've got 4 leaders, and I'm going to, if I may, Madam President, start with you, and I'm going to throw a tough one at you, which I'm going to repeat to several others on the panel, which was you've worked very hard for Lithuania to get into Europe. Given the events of the last few days, where, after all, what was the prize you were seeking? Stability, growth, reform. Those were supposed to be the rewards of getting into Europe. Was the journey worth it? And looking today, did you get what you expected?
I think we got everything we expected and more. In addition, of course, the journey was long, about 10 years for us. And in our region, we did a huge amount of reforms, democratized our society, and practically introduced market economy. But of course, it was fast, very rapid, robust, and socially tense period. It cost a lot. And we thought that after we joined the European Union, at least, the hardest work will be done. But it looks that every day new challenges are falling on us. And the road towards membership was worth, mainly because we were capable to reform ourselves as much as we would like and as deeply as it was necessary. And this experience of reforming fast, taking challenges, openness, and courage to talk with people openly, what is necessary to do, helping already now, then we, all of us in our region, started to feel global problems and failures already by the end of 2008. And having that in mind and having this experience of managing ourselves, already in 2009, we took initiatives and adjusted our economy and reduced our spendings through all our economy, including real salaries, real pensions, real pays in social benefits by 4% of GDP in 1 year. And of course, our economy is very small. Of course, we are a very open society and economy. Of course, we depend very much on external markets, but still, taking into account global pressures, national governments and national politicians with a clear responsibility can still manage a lot inside the country if decisions are at least reduced from political populism. This is not easy, Any government pays the price. My neighbor paid for free governments, I think, for that. We still not paying for free governments, but we already losing, and our government is losing credibility because of very difficult measures, but necessary measures. So from outside, we look as country which is capable to manage. Inside, people are angry. But that's probably is our objective reason how it is happening. Why I'm saying that the road towards membership was perfect school, which helped us to manage today's situation, where we understood that we can rely the first on ourselves, only then second on European Union. And that experience which is very useful still.
Well, that's, of course, a fascinating, but not the answer one might have expected a year or so ago, because basically you're arguing the journey to join Europe was what sort of gave you the training and hardened you and gave you the political capacity to take difficult and unpopular decisions. But Europe itself, it's not the prize that's worth it, it was the journey that gave you these strengths and capabilities.
Yes and no. Journey was important, but also if to take the messages now, that, for example, during the huge downturn and fall, today annually the assistance from the European funds, for example, practically amounts to 25% of our budget. That's significant assistance. Yeah. That's clearly, you cannot deny it.
Yeah, thank you. Prime Minister, you have been, and Latvia have been very, very anxious about joining the euro. Does that look quite such a good idea as it did a few months ago?
Certainly, our plans as regards euro has not changed. We still intend to meet Maastricht criteria in 2012, which would mean that we could join euro in January 1st, 2014, given that the current rules are held. So there are two worries as regards Eurozone. First part is the credibility of the Eurozone itself, where I think it's a good news that yesterday there was this rescue package for Greece and also proposed guarantee mechanism to address crisis in a better manner. On another hand, what is really needed is control mechanism within Eurozone to make sure that countries in Eurozone have to follow Maastricht criteria. There was such a control mechanism, sanctions mechanism in a Stability and Growth Pact. It was scrapped in 2003. Now, apparently, the time has come to reintroduce this control mechanism. Second is what we hear and what worries us somewhat as a debate that there should be some postponement of the Eurozone enlargement or amending of the criteria so that new countries could not enter. And I think it's a quite misguided debate, because the problem of the Eurozone are not new countries, because there it's quite clear, you either meet Maastricht criteria or you are not allowed in. The problem is lack of control mechanisms within Eurozone, and the fact that most of the Eurozone countries do not follow Maastricht criteria. So really, we hope this debate will not move into not allowing Eurozone enlargement, and this test will come pretty soon. With the case of Estonia, it's a matter of coming weeks and months.
I mean, you must worry a bit that there's almost a double standard. Both of you have made these dramatic adjustments to restore your public finances, and yet you didn't sort of stop the euro in the way that the Greece crisis has, and yet you may be penalized because you may not be allowed into the euro. Do you feel there's a double standard?
Well, this we will see pretty soon, and I think the real test is in Estonia, which had a 15% recession last year and yet 1.7% of GDP budget deficit. So they clearly met Maastricht criteria. They are fiscally one of the most prudent countries, and there we will see if Eurozone is willing to stick with its own rules or will invent new rules not to allow Estonia in. And of course it will have implications for Latvia and I assume also Lithuania, in a sense that if there is a credibility that Eurozone enlargement is an open process, it's also an incentive and possibility for us to explain to the people that measures we do are needed. We will join a Eurozone in a due time. Whereas if this will not be the case, then it will become also more difficult to explain why, for example, we need to meet Maastricht criteria in 2012, why a budget deficit of 3% and not 3.5%.
Mr. Djelic, I mean, Serbia has really, this issue of accession and has been a driving dynamic of your country's politics for quite a few years now to meet Europe's demands, if you like. Do you sort of look now and wonder whether the prize is going to be worth it?
Well, for sure, the enlargement is going to become more demanding. The criteria for countries to join Europe and to join the Eurozone are going to be tougher. But at the same time, that's not necessarily a bad thing as long as there is a win-win solution. Europe has still its soft power aspect, and definitely for the Western Balkans, as history never stops, either you have a European agenda, or if you don't, then you will probably have another agenda. So that's why it's always an important thing to keep this European integration process going. I was last week in Berlin, and I was testifying in front of the Bundestag the day when the Greek package was being voted. And of course, in opening, I said to the members of parliament, ladies and gentlemen, just what you wanted, another Balkan country. Here we are. And yet, then I told them that we froze wages and pensions in October of 2008, having done a precautionary program with the IMF and the EU in 2007, that our total debt to GDP is 32% of GDP, that we're the only country upgraded by the OECD last year, and that the capital adequacy ratio of our banks, 80% of them euro-based, of the mother banks, and that the stress scenarios run by the IMF and the ECB show no need for recapitalization. But that's also the truth, and therefore what we need is to keep this process going, because that's something that has a very powerful and beneficial effect on the domestic, I would say, political front. And at the same time, even though I do not expect the generosity to be at the level as it used to be before, it used to be that when Spain or Portugal would join, they would get between 3 and 5% of GDP, not only budgets, but very significant transfers. It is not going to be as good a deal as it was, but it's still a very good deal, and the best deal on the table for our countries as well.
Minister, you listen to this and you hear, I think, that economic liberalism, your credo, probably does even better in the accession countries than it does in Belgium. You're hearing, countries that have joined, a country that wants to join, and the level of adjustment that they have made, the rigor they've shown in their public finances, is one that old Europe would find enviable. Do you think you can learn a lesson, and will we see now with the agreement of the last few days similar levels of adjustment here?
Well, it's like here I am, old Europe, there they are, new Europe. Well, let me say, I think that what those three countries and other countries have achieved is remarkable. And at the same time, I think that the comfort of the euro, of having the euro, has postponed a lot of structural reforms in all Eurozone countries, including our country. And what we've seen last weekend, the response, the massive response of European institutions, I hope is a wake-up call, prevented us from a real downfall. But I think after the euphoria of the markets yesterday, what you see in the public mood is sobriety. That means that most people today realize that the battle to come is an uphill battle. That means that, especially in Belgium, but also other countries, we have elections in a few weeks. Holland has elections to come. UK just had elections. That is for the next few years. Those politicians continuing to promise the moon in this continent will not be longer credible. So the message is that there will be probably a decade of austerity that is necessary, but let's put it in a positive way. I think 2010 could become a new start for Europe. Because either we go for the future of a footnote continent comparing to the United States, where you have economic growth predicted above 3%, not speaking about China, India, and other countries, or you go to a real world player with real economic growth, and that is Europe, but that means more growth than we have today. Predictions are 1%, 1.5%. That is not enough to pay for the welfare that all Europe, so-called all Europe, has today. So what you need is, I think, two things. First of all, I think you need more European ambition. There is huge benefits awaiting. 500 million customers, high-income, middle-income customers. The single market is not yet there. There's a lot of protectionism, national champs protected by member states, especially in the old Europe, that prevents us from real growth. And secondly, what you need are brave, honest politicians on the national level that say to the people, hey there, if you want to protect that welfare, we should work longer and we should work harder, including the politicians, of course. And this is the only way, because it is either reform or it is decline. That is the reality.
Thank you. Look, let me, it's a very good point, if I may, and I'm going to come right back to you, but I want to do so by reminding us that, you know, formally the session, the question put to this session was the issue of Europe 2020, the new document that is to replace the Lisbon Agenda. And it sets 5 goals, although I think it's still got to complete its winding path through the different approval processes. Those goals are increasing the employment rate to 75% in Europe, boosting spending on research and development to 3% of GDP, attaining the sort of 2020 climate energy targets, lifting 20 million people out of poverty, cutting the school dropout rate to 10% from the current 15%. And I think probably to everybody on this panel and the audience, you know, there's a sort of sleepwalking quality to this. It doesn't seem related to the sheer scale of challenge that Europe now faces. It certainly begs the question that if the Lisbon Agenda didn't work, why would these goals adopted 10 years later work? But more fundamentally, it seems to duck the issue that surely we're not at a point of setting incremental goals for Europe. We're at a point, as you just hinted, Minister, of saying, look, we're living under completely different fiscal ceilings for the next 10 years. We're living in a much more intense global competitive environment where Europe is in danger of being at the losing end. You know, what is the fiscal framework which is going to allow us forward, and how does it relate to what has received a lot of attention over the last day here, which is obviously the core for many of us of Europe's comparative advantage, if you like, is the sort of social market model. But what I don't think we've answered yet, and maybe we can in this final session, is that model affordable anymore, given the fiscal ceiling we have? And what does it really mean anyway? Because across the countries represented at this platform today, there are very different levels of social spending and social provision. So what is it that we're defending? Is it affordable? And is it realistic in terms of the decade of difficulty we have ahead? And Minister, let me start with you, and we'll then just go down this way.
Well, I think that EU 2020, I don't want to get very institutional about it. It's less targets, it's better monitored. It's not that bad. But what I miss really is an ambition for more entrepreneurship. Because if you talk about growth and you want to have more growth, what you need are more entrepreneurs and more lean way for those entrepreneurs to create the growth. And that is really lacking in the document, sorry to say so. Look at the United States, for example. If you look at the export power of the United States, more than 50%, and that is for the first time in 2010, for the first time, the United States export more to emerging markets than to what I would call developed markets. But for example, Belgium, with all due respect for my country, we only export 3% to China, and 75% goes to the EU 15 classical states. So if you want to have more entrepreneurship, you'll need less bureaucracy, more leeway for the entrepreneurs to become European players, and that means the single market, and so lesser protectionism. And secondly, you need more ambition towards real exportation. And that is, I think, the core of the issue. And that, I think, is the only way to continue to survive what we call the social market model. We talk too much about social, sorry to say so, but we talk too less about market.
Madam President.
Okay, 2020. You, in the introduction, said that this document replacing Lisbon. My question, do we need to replace Lisbon at all? Nothing was at all. Do we need to replace that? Then in 2020, we have 4 or 5 targets. Are they sufficient and good enough reacting to the challenges we are facing? Is this the recipe as prescription in Apotheca that if we fulfill these 4 targets, we are safe and prosper? No. Nobody guarantees anything. Especially nobody can say that one size fits all. Of course, we will have so-called national programs, but only based mainly on these as directions, targets. But in today's problematic, I think it's a very, very narrow segment, what we're talking about. We really still facing the global challenges in global economic downturn in financial sector. That means for our future financial stability, still the risk exists. And we have national regulations, not even European ones. So we have virtual economic crisis and bubble, and we have national or maximum regionalize or try to have European level regulations. So in total, then we discussing 2020, already after last week's events, it became too narrow for discussion. But anyway, if going to this narrow item, I will say that still unclear clear ownership, still unclear the, how it will be delivered, and the sanctions if it will be not delivered. That means, or we are really replacing not very successful Lisbon, or we try to have something more successful. That's only time, processes, and flexibility of the document and process can help, because if we stick to the document and we will not change it, and we will try to fulfill routinely, bureaucratically what we are today having on the table, it will be a huge mistake. Because it is projected for the 10 years ahead, we every day seeing changing world. Every day seeing different understanding and different future of our fiscal stability in most of our countries, and what we can afford during the next 10 years, having in mind our fiscal situation. And then we're talking about some kind of social models we try to accommodate. We do have already in Europe different understanding of it, different quality of it, and different capabilities to perform. In our countries, in EU member states, still our payments and social benefits are comparatively lower. Why for us, probably it's easier mentally to adapt for new difficult measures we probably will supposed to introduce. But of course, then we talk about some kind of coordinated attitude towards social model on European level. We're far away from it. It's too diverse. We understand a lot of things differently, especially in some regions, as our regions, we went quite fast into market liberalization in everything, including in social relations, including in labor market. Why to think that 2020 will help equally good and well all 27? That's quite an illusion. Why probably to have as open process which can absorb additional measures in future, additional tens of and priorities in future during these 10 years will be maybe better, and your approach not to stick just to what we have on the table today, because I'm not sure that it is what is on the table today is the answer for the nearest years.
Thank you. Prime Minister.
Well, I would say the best we can do now to protect what we call European social model is to focus this EU 2020 strategy as much as we can on growth and jobs. This really seems to be a priority. If we will ensure growth, we will be better able to ensure EU social model. So what can be done in this sense? Of course, we need to address the bottlenecks which exist in order to improve our growth. And first, it's a business environment. Something is being talked very little. Also, in respect of EU 2020 strategies, there should be actually much more into it about improving of business environment, cutting red tape, removing the existing barriers in the EU internal market, SME support, and enabling or more actively enabling Small Business Act, labor market reforms, all that kind of issues which can boost the EU growth potential. If we talk on new member states, there's also another important aspect that best way we can go to the social cohesion there is through the economic cohesion. So really also it's a role of EU cohesion policy which should be more interlinked into EU 2020 strategy. So I think if we will focus on growth, if we will focus on improving business environment, we will also be able to better address our social problems in the aging society.
Well, on the face of it, the document is better than what Lisbon was. Less targets, more comprehensive, I would say, at the same time. But I guess the issue is, can we get there? It will be desirable to get there with differences, national differences. The issue is, do we have the conditions to succeed? So first of all, at the national level, granted, we do have differences, for sure. This being said, one common theme we have heard over the last 2 days, and I guess that's a theme for several years and several political cycles, is that there is a tyranny of one generation. This is the baby boomers who are exhibiting an egoism of historical proportions, having lived through the 30 great years of development, and now, because they have the swing vote in almost every country, hanging on to their entitlements and to their future pensions at almost all costs, and de facto blocking a lot of governments in implementing the reform. And if you think that new Europe is younger than old Europe, you're wrong. We are older than old Europe. And in that sense, those problems are actually even more acute in some of those countries which are supposed to catch up, which of course makes the job even more difficult. Then on the level of Europe, again in Berlin, interestingly, Germans, seems to me, have become specialists of the Greek retirement system. They analyze and they compare in large circulation papers when they go, what is the early retirement, what do the policemen can get, and so forth. And in that sense, it took 10 years to discover that true common market requires a common currency, and it would appear that this crisis and 10 more years show that it's going to be very difficult to have a common currency without tightly coordinated fiscal and even social policies in some point of time. And maybe that's politically not very palatable, but at the end of the day, the payers would want to make sure that the receivers do not have an easier go. It should be more logically that the people who need to catch up should work even harder, not less than those who have achieved something in before. And then I guess the third point is to, in this 2020, is to talk about science, technology, innovation, entrepreneurship. I guess what we will see, that's more than a hypothesis. We see it in telecom equipment, we will see it in a lot of the internet enablers, we will see it in aerospace, and I'm sure we will see it more and more in infrastructure. In November last year, for the first time, Chinese companies won on an EU-financed highway project in Poland. Currently in Belgrade, we are building a bridge over the Danube with Chinese money. And I guess we will see more and more, not only the United States doubling their expenditures and then trying to attract ever more of the European brains, as they have been doing successfully over the past few decades, but also new competitors, and a call for all of us to really focus on this issue so as to be able to have something to export. And in that sense, I think we need something like a new Airbus, something that can fire up the imagination of the people, something concrete, maybe a green electrical car, where Europe can lead, and where only Europe can address the American and the Chinese and maybe the Indian competition. And in that sense, and that's my last point, there's also a need for Europe a bit more to flex its muscle, because at times the ideology and the open market, of course, are the most desirable things, and yet we do not face the same amount of openness and fair game in other geographies, in other markets. We have seen it in Copenhagen. Europe was leading, but was unable to have the leverage to get to a world agreement. And the same story would need to have us think quite hard on how to leverage the fact that we have the biggest market in the world in order to affect and to make us successful in the long run.
Okay, well, there you have it. The 2020 document probably okay, but hardly up to the scale of the challenges that Europe faces. Let's now open it to the floor and throw in questions, points as widely as you like, because I think this is for all of us a chance to sum up what the last day and a half has meant in terms of messages for where this region is going. In the back right.
My name is Joost Martens from Consumers International. There's a lot of talk about the need for growth, but there's no talk about sustainability. And it is like in this need for growth, we can not afford sustainability as if it were a luxury. So I think we should regain the previous discussion about sustainable growth, and perhaps that's where Europe should look for its advantage, because sustainable growth, sustainable consumption is what we need for this world.
Thank you. There was one up the front. Yes.
Hi, Juliares with the European Commission. It's more of a personal anecdote, really. I'm married to an Indian, and we have an Indian friend here, an executive for a multinational company. He worked here in Brussels for a year and was very fond of the soup that they served in the canteen at his office. But he found one day in July that there was no more soup. And so he inquired about it, and apparently the person who was dealing with the soup was on holiday for a couple of months. And so was the whole supply of the soup, you know, the person who sold the ingredients and the van that transported the soup. So anyway, he was very surprised about the fact that he couldn't eat soup for a couple of months. And I think he really used it as a sort of point just to say how surprised he was that, you know, at the bottom line, really, there's a lot of Europeans who really don't want to work that much. I mean, the main motivation factor for a lot of Europeans, because we're a rich society in a way, I guess, is to go on holiday and to retire early. And how do we reconcile this with the sort of challenges that we have been discussing?
Great. Yes, over here.
Kirsty Hughes, Oxfam. Two comments. One, not really fully with my Oxfam hat on. We're very good at beating ourselves up in Europe, very good. I mean, 25 years ago, I was doing my PhD on European competitiveness. In the early 80s, I look back at books from the 1960s about the American challenge. There's always somebody challenging us, somebody we're not better than. Actually, if you notice, we're still here. We're still a huge trade bloc. You've got Germany as the one of the two top leading exporting countries in the world. If we want to become a low-carbon Europe by 2050, as we absolutely must, we're perfectly capable of doing that. So where's the kind of confidence, not only about the competitiveness, but also about our welfare state? It may need reforming. Maybe the baby boomers have got it wrong, but what about, well, we can't be as rich as we thought we were going to be, but we're going to be more equal societies. We're going to be better societies. We're going to think about well-being. Where's some of that positive vision? And putting my Oxfam hat back on, if we don't have that sort of positive vision, how are we going to look out towards the world and take our responsibility for the world more seriously, whether it's our responsibility because we caused that climate change? I mean, it was pathetic. We weren't just sidelined at Copenhagen. We chose to be sidelined. We didn't use our negotiating skills and our supposed leverage. What about the impact of the global economic crisis on the poorest countries in the world, who very clearly didn't cause it? And it's even in World Bank estimates pushing 50 to 100 million more people into poverty. Where's our responsibility towards them? Well, yes, we're the biggest development spender in the world. Good, so let's keep that and think how we're going to use it. So I don't think we're going to get out of this current economic crisis with these 2020 documents and everything else if we don't have a much, much more compelling political narrative? And that's got to come from the public and from civil society, but it's also got to come from our leaders too.
Great.
Thank you.
Jeffrey.
Jeff Lippman from the UN World Tourism Organization. Listening just to the debate, and first the minister saying we had to have a new ideal, and then the following speaker who talked about let's bring sustainability back into the equation, and then listening to Kirsty in that positive way, talking also about the need for a higher value, perhaps social inclusion. Maybe the thing that we're looking for, which has now become the sort of strategic drive of the G20 and the UN system, is the green economy. And maybe Europe should actually set itself up to become the champions of the green economy, which at the moment it looks very much as though China is setting itself up to do.
Right. I'm going to actually call on somebody from the floor, Timothy Garton-Ash, and ask him, as a long-time writer about European affairs, as he listens to this discussion, are we right to be sort of rather pessimistic and feeling burdened by the challenges of Europe, or should we actually shrug it off and argue that Europe's always like this? Because it is certainly the case that coming to a European forum of the World Economic Forum after having been in other regions immediately before it, whatever their problems, there was just an energy, a euphoria, these problems we can overcome, we'll be back to high growth. Why is Europe so depressed?
It's not. It's not.
Can we have a microphone?
Too much rain in Brussels.
Over there.
Over there.
Well, thank you, Mark. Kirsty is certainly right to say that one could fill a whole book with obituaries of the European project and crises and episodes of Euro-fatalism and Euro-pessimism. I have to say, I think this one is very serious in historical terms, because I do not think we have the great drivers of the European project that we had for most of the post-war period, and because the global challenges we face, and particularly the emerging great powers, are huge competition. For me, the conclusion from this conference is what a couple of our speakers have already said, that we cannot continue in the old rhetoric of simply saying we must defend our European social model and just have a little bit more growth and work a bit harder and a bit better. That is totally inadequate to the challenge we face. We have to set about and totally redesign the European social model, the European social market economy, and then we will have a chance. So what we need from our leaders is not that rather emollient, reassuring rhetoric we get from our leaders, but the language of blood, sweat, and tears.
Thank you. Charles Grant here, another long-term observer of Europe. Charles.
Well, I totally share all the gloom applying to, say, the next 5 years, but I can only be more optimistic if I think more about the long term. Because I think in the long term, we can be more optimistic. I think the Euro crisis will do more for economic reform in Southern Europe than the Lisbon Agenda or EU 2020 will ever do. It is going to be brutal and nasty. It'll force through hard, harsh reforms. And I think 10 years from now, we'll be seeing the dividends of that. And 10 years from now, either we have a dynamic, lean, mean Southern European economy, or the Eurozone will have broken up. And I think I take the optimistic view there. Secondly, the whole set of issues around energy will, I think, create a dynamic for integration in Europe, because we are building a single market, however imperfectly and slowly. We do care about our energy security. We are going to learn to speak with one voice in our external energy relations, because harsh self-interest will push us to do that. We have no alternative. That will drive forward that will drive forward integration. And finally, it's the geostrategic element that you just mentioned, Mark. I think that a lot of Europeans maybe want to live in a big Switzerland that doesn't worry about problems in other parts of the world and doesn't want to think about security challenges. But actually, a lot of Europeans, when they see a G2 emerging, when they see that on all the important decisions, the US and China are the voices that count on financial regulation or climate change or immigration issues or counterterrorism, then I think a lot of Europeans will wake up and say, hang on, we don't want the US and China to dominate the 21st century, and we need a voice too. And then that'll help the kind of political integration in Europe that many of us would like to see. So I think in the very long run, we can be more optimistic, but there's going to be 5 years of ghastly crisis and introversion and blaming each other and lack of solidarity and people not trusting each other before we come through to towards those sunny slopes 10 years ahead.
Anyone else want to come in on the prognosis before we come back to the panel? Okay, well, to the panel. I mean, I think we've sort of heard the different range of views very well put from the floor here, but you would probably, what unites the optimists and the pessimists is actually either whichever camp you're in, there's got to be fundamental reform. The division is more about, is that achievable or not? I don't really hear anybody thinking that Europe can kind of bump along as it is, and we've heard from the audience the reference to the massive sort of baby boomer problem where the people who are the engine of the growth, the ones who like to have those holidays and everything else that has become their aspirational focus are now finding themselves joining the ranks of the retired with a huge carrying cost to the European economy. So these are difficult times, and I think we're all talking about the need to have a real ambition about fiscal limits and re-engineering the social model to reflect those fiscal limits. But if we may, let's go once more. We'll start the other end this time, but once more through our panel to have some closing observations on this.
Well, I guess does one need to be a pessimist? Well, one cannot afford to be a pessimist. And at all levels, I mean, be it in the government or NGO or other sectors, one needs to really look this reality in the face. And it's really a more challenging one than it used to be, because there's a couple of billion other humans who are now producing more and more the type of stuff we used to produce. And mind you, at this point in time, they're able to produce it cheaper and maybe even at a better quality. And it's not anymore, shoes, textile, and toys. It is getting to be more the Airbuses and the things that Ericsson produces. So the threat to the market caps and the profitability of what are today the stabilizers of some of the rich societies. But this being said, a crisis focuses everybody's minds. There is now a clear view of how Europe should function at this level of integration. Some, at times, unpalatable conclusions have to be drawn, and I am, although we are not at the table yet, but we're trying to influence every bit and to give our contribution, that in the October Council, we will see some movements such as the establishment of this European Monetary Fund, a possibility for a European rating agency that will not have the pretty ugly conflict of interest issue that the current competitors have, the possibility then to be more assertive and with more leverage on the COP16 or 17, if in Cancun an agreement cannot be reached, and then also once a more specific and also national level 2020 targets being implemented to get on with those projects. And I guess the focus on all of this, if you look deep down with the public opinions, yes, there are those who will be making a lot of noise. Nobody can say that we will not see more terrible things happening, because indeed, in some quarters, the situation is really difficult. But at the same time, I believe that there is a lot of realization within the public opinions that this time it's really serious and that everybody has to do more than just a bit more work and a bit more contribution. So I think, yeah, it's going to be tough in the next 2 or 3 years, but I think we're going to get there.
Prime Minister.
Coming from the EU member state, which competes very closely with Sweden being number 1 or number 2, which produces the highest share of energy from renewable sources, more than 1/3 of our energies comes from renewables, and also producing least CO2 emissions per capita in the EU 27. I'll probably just add a couple of points on this sustainable development. Well, certainly 2020 targets are part of the EU 2020 strategy. So targets are there, and in fact, also during the crisis and with the fiscal limitations we have, there are many things we can do to meet those targets and to move more towards sustainable development. And one example, you do not always need high-tech or anything like this. One example is energy efficiency. Like, for example, now expanded quite substantially the housing energy efficiency program to improve heat isolation of housing. And if we look at the biggest polluter in Europe is not industry or not transportation, it is a housing sector, energy associated with heating or cooling buildings. Then there are awful many things which you can do. First, stimulating economy in short run. Second, reducing your energy dependency from imported energy. Third, reducing your emissions. So there are really many things you can do without green ideas, without 2020 strategy being too fiscally expensive. In fact, you can save money if you target proper areas. So there are many things we can do for sustainable development, and I think we will do them. Then, of course, there is a philosophical question of what happened in Copenhagen with our 2020 proposals. We know nobody else is nowhere close to that level of proposals. But probably we also should listen what developing world was saying. I think it was more clearly pronounced by India, which were really clear. Okay, you in the West agree to whatever per capita emission targets you want, and we in India will go below those targets. So philosophically talking, if there is a, so to say, human right to pollute, then it should be equal to all humans. And that's something we in West should keep in mind when we are negotiating emission reduction targets now in Bonn and in Mexico, in Cancun next time.
Going a little bit to a more macroeconomic picture between the economic centers of the world, and seeing and trying to see the European side of it. I think that already Europe is shaking a lot from global pressures, but still we're trying not to wake up and not to smell reality. Reality is running after us in one country or in another, as we have now, for example, in South Europe, but still we're trying to do mainly window dressing. And this I mean by including Agenda 2020. And by the politically correct language, for example, to save, to defend whatever we had. Do we need to save what we had? Maybe let's think about what we need to have and to defend openness and capability to change in Europe. Otherwise, the more we will defend what we have, the less we will be able to defend what we have or had. So from this point of view, for us, smaller nations, open nations, dynamic nations, it's easier. As I said, we have been challenged, we have been beaten by situation, by competition, by difficulties, and we are ready to take on ourselves more. But still, for Europe in general, then we're trying to cook and prepare a lot of political papers which are not workable, which are not helping. It's really avoidance of seeing reality eye to eye. And here we need to understand that Europe cannot live alone, cannot survive in this globalized situation alone. Why all measures? And creation the regional European institutions is not enough. including European funds, regulatory bodies, it's not enough if these bodies will work separately from international accepted bodies and not reformed bodies, including rating agencies, IMF, World Bank, and other financial institutions which still work in old manner, non-reformed, and we do not have different instruments. And if, for example, our accounting rules or understanding of banking in Europe is different from what is going on, for example, in New York, what we're talking about. The situation and challenges are globalized. The approach we still have national, even only national, not yet European. Why? Europe, if will be not able to concentrate, to coordinate, to agree together what we need to do, for us will be very difficult to compete. Why here I want to say that it's not about pessimism, opposite. The first to formulate reality, then to know how to go about it. That means positive, that means optimism, but with absolutely open, realistic understanding what is going on and in the world. So why, for me, we in our country try to be critical not only about ourselves, but also what we can do, how we discuss the projects in Europe, why we are so enough positively critical towards 2020. We don't want this document or this project or this idea to fail before it birth, and to fail as it was with other strategies as Lisbon, for example. Why in the Council together, most of us, we are uncomfortably for some countries questioning a lot of questions and giving a lot of problems, but we would like any strategy workable, effective and resultative. Why all feeling around the room and around the conference is not only about just one or another paper, one or another idea. It's about how long after the crisis started, really we started to feel it in 2007 already, we're still talking about necessity of coordinate, about necessity to manage joint problems together, and still working separately, Europe including. So I don't know how long the world will be only talking. Probably after another broke or problem or some kind of difficulty, large difficulty. Europe including, not only Europe but Eurozone, is now on the edge of facing another trouble. And how fast it will react, as it did on Sunday, not only politically, but really how fast the measures will be introduced and agreements will be reached, really, not just by political correct language, that will result, Eurozone will manage or not. And here we had already, and it is very right, a lot of countries, 16 now, do have one currency, but do not have at all one fiscal policy. We do have central bank, but we do not have really single monetary policy. Is it possible at all? You can ask any academical economist, and probably he will argue, no, practically it's very difficult. That means Stability Pact was created to at least to try to coordinate fiscal policies, what we did with it. Exactly before crisis in 2005, we just laundered it out, loosened it, and it's not helpful at all in this environment. So if our economic policies will go together with economic cycle and our election cycles, of course, it will be very difficult for all of us to agree, because every year in each country or in Europe, we have elections after elections. And if we forget that economics have their own cycle, not necessarily depending on a political cycle, we will be failing again. So why I just want to finalize saying that we need to clearly agree what kind of Europe we want, how deep integration we want, and in what areas we want to agree. Otherwise, we will be only discussion club, larger with enlargement, looser with enlargement, less decisive with enlargement, and not resultative with enlargement. So if we will understand these problems in future, hopefully we will be able to avoid them.
Thanks very much, Madam President. Minister, last word.
Yes, well, when I listen to my three colleagues, it reminds me of the saying that European Union is very good at telling member states, candidate member states, what they should do, but is less well in reforming itself. So maybe that could be a lesson for us. Secondly, I'm not pessimistic, not at all. If Greek socialists can reform, everybody can. Yes, we can. So, but the point that the gentleman there made is quite clear. He said, okay, the euro crisis was a wake-up call. The question is, how do we stay awake? How do we stay awake? And then I think the only answer is, of course, ambition, targets, etc. You need an instance, an institution that is willing to look at it. And I believe, I'm a Belgian, sorry to say so, that Europe there, European Commission, and European institutions have a unique opportunity. That is to show their teeth. And that means that respecting the Growth and Stability Pact, respecting the targets, EU 2020, or enlarged towards growth, respecting, real respecting, that this is really the core essence, because the issue, I mean, there are huge member states of so-called old Europe that never respected the Growth and Stability Pact. If there is no respect for targets, how do you want that once we can have a very good content? I listened to all the questions. I won't respond to them, but I think really the lady of Oxfam and others, I'm a free market liberal, but I'm very proud of the social system that we have. But the big question today is, if we want to continue to have a social model, then it's ununderstandable that today in my country, when a company like Opel, GM in Antwerp closes, that people at the age of 52 can say, I go on a pre-pension scheme. This is unaffordable. We can't pay it any longer. So if you want to continue to have a social model, which I'm willing to protect, you need economic sustainability. And that is the core issue. So let's do first things first. And first things first is growth, room to entrepreneurship. And that is, of course, the need for the World Economic Forum. That is entrepreneurship. That is the beginning of everything.
Well, thanks. What an interesting discussion. I mean, I think it confirms everybody feels there's a need for really tough choices, that European politics needs to recalibrate itself to live within the limits of the fiscal ceilings of the coming years, that there can be no sacred cows. We have to be ruthless about what we preserve in order to create space for the new initiatives that we want to build up. I think climate change was clearly referred to by a number, a green economy as one of the ways forward that we need to do much more in. But I think what all the panelists gave us was a sense of that, Europe is at a bit of a crossroads. There's a way forward, which means you don't stop at one currency. You've got to have a higher degree of coordination across one fiscal, one social, you name it, perhaps. Or Europe goes another direction where it, as the President said, gets looser, larger, and less effective. And so this is a challenge. And I think this discussion has reflected the debates of the last day and a half, and I think we're grateful to everybody who's participated in them. Let me now ask Andre Schneider, Managing Director of the Forum and its COO, to close the meeting for us.
Thank you very much, and I will be very short because I think the important things have been said. So distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, I can only thank you for your engaged participation in this World Economic Forum on Europe. It was very timely, there were important discussions, and I think if there's one thing I would like to give you home is the theme was renewed leadership, new vision. I think there is still many things up to do, to decide, to really go and find the right solutions, and we heard many of the directions which have to be taken. But I think I would like to spawn a bridge now and saying, even if I agree we need to have actions after discussion, but discussions are at the fundament of actions. So I want to invite you all to join us again in 1 year at the next World Economic Forum on Europe and Central Asia, which we will be holding in Vienna from the 8th to 9th of June. to actually get together and pursue this discussion, but also use this now to look also further to Central and Eastern Europe, Central Asia, the Caucasus, and the Black Sea region. So thank you very much to everyone, and I'm looking forward to see you next year in Vienna.
Andre, if I may, just before we, could we just say a special word of thanks to the Crown Prince, who's with us this morning, has been such a force in getting this meeting organized and in supporting it. And as always, you're so discreet about it that I'm not sure everybody here recognizes the role you've played, Prince Philip, in this, and thank you.
Thank you, Mike.
Going on and in the world. So why, for me, we in our country try to be critical not only about ourselves, but also what we can do, how we discuss the projects in Europe, why we are so enough positively critical towards 2020. We don't want this document or this project or this idea to fail before it birth, and to fail as it was with other strategies, as Lisbon, for example. Why in the Council together, most of us, we are uncomfortably for some countries questioning a lot of questions and giving a lot of problems, but we would like any strategy workable, effective and resultative. Why all feeling around the room and around the conference is not only about just one or another paper, one or another idea. It's about how long after the crisis started. Really, we started to feel it in 2007 already. We're still talking about necessity of coordinate, about necessity to manage joint problems together, and still working separately, Europe including. So I don't know how long the world will be only talking. Probably after another broke or problem or some kind of difficulty, large difficulty. Europe including, not only Europe but Eurozone, is now on the edge of facing another trouble. And how fast it will react, as it did on Sunday, not only politically, but really how fast the measures will be introduced and agreements will be reached, really, not just by political correct language, that will result, Eurozone will manage or not. And here we had already, and it is very right, a lot of countries, 16 now, do have one currency, but do not have at all one fiscal policy. We do have central bank, but we do not have really single monetary policy. Is it possible at all? You can ask any academical economist, and probably he will argue, no, practically it's very difficult. That means Stability Pact was created to at least to try to coordinate fiscal policies. What we did with it, exactly before crisis in 2005, we just laundered it out, loosened it, and it's not helpful at all in this environment. So if our economic policies will go together with economic cycle and our election cycles, of course, it will be very difficult for all of us to agree, because every year in each country or in Europe, we have elections after elections. And if we forget that economics have their own cycle, not necessarily depending on a political cycle, we will be failing again. So why I just want to finalize saying that we need to clearly agree what kind of Europe we want, how deep integration we want, and in what areas we want to agree. Otherwise, we will be only a discussion club, larger with enlargement, looser with enlargement, less decisive with enlargement, and not resultative with enlargement. So if we will understand these problems in future, hopefully we will be able to avoid them.
Thanks very much, Madam President. Minister, last word.
Yes, well, when I listen to my three colleagues, it reminds me of the saying that the European Union is very good at telling member states, candidate member states, what they should do, but is less well in reforming itself. So maybe that could be a lesson for us. Secondly, I'm not pessimistic, not at all. If Greek socialists can reform, Everybody can. Yes, we can. So, but the point that the gentleman there made is quite clear. He said, okay, the euro crisis was a wake-up call. The question is, how do we stay awake? How do we stay awake? And then I think the only answer is, of course, ambition, targets, etc. You need an instance, an institution that is willing to look at it. And I believe, I'm a Belgian, sorry to say so, that Europe there, European Commission, and European institutions have a unique opportunity. That is to show their teeth. And that means that respecting the Growth and Stability Pact, respecting the targets, EU 2020, or enlarged towards growth, respecting, real respecting, that this is really the core essence, because the issue, I mean, there are huge member states of so-called old Europe that never respected the Growth and Stability Pact. If there is no respect for targets, how do you want that once we can have a very good content? I listened to all the questions. I won't respond to them, but I think really the lady of Oxfam and others, I'm a free market liberal, but I'm very proud of the social system that we have. But the big question today is, if we want to continue to have a social model, then it's ununderstandable that today in my country, when a company like Opel, GM in Antwerp closes, that people at the age of 52 can say, I go on a pre-pension scheme. This is unaffordable. We can't pay it any longer. So if you want to continue to have a social model, which I'm willing to protect, you need economic sustainability. And that is the core issue. So let's do first things first. And first things first is growth, room to entrepreneurship. And that is, of course, the need for the World Economic Forum. That is entrepreneurship. That is the beginning of everything.
Well, thanks. What an interesting discussion. I mean, I think it confirms everybody feels there's a need for really tough choices, that European politics needs to recalibrate itself to live within the limits of the fiscal ceilings of the coming years, that there can be no sacred cows. We have to be ruthless about what we preserve in order to create space for the new initiatives that we want to build up. I think climate change was clearly referred to by a number, a green economy as one of the ways forward that we need to do much more in. But I think what all the panelists gave us was a sense of that, you know, Europe is at a bit of a crossroads. There's a way forward, which means you don't stop at one currency. You've got to have a higher degree of coordination across one fiscal, one social, you name it, perhaps. Or Europe goes another direction where it, as the President said, gets looser, larger, and less effective. And so this is a challenge. And I think this discussion has reflected the debates of the last day and a half, and I think we're grateful to everybody who's participated in them. Let me now ask Andre Schneider, Managing Director of the Forum and its COO, to close the meeting for us.
Thank you very much, and I will be very short because I think the important things have been said. So distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, I can only thank you for your engaged participation in this World Economic Forum on Europe. It was very timely, there were important discussions, and I think if there's one thing I would like to give you home is the theme was renewed leadership, new vision. I think there is still many things up to do, to decide, to really go and find the right solutions, and we heard many of the directions which have to be taken. But I think I would like to spawn a bridge now and saying, even if I agree we need to have actions after discussion, but discussions are at the fundament of actions. So I want to invite you all to join us again in 1 year at the next World Economic Forum on Europe and Central Asia, which we will be holding in Vienna from the 8th to 9th of June, to actually get together and pursue this discussion, but also use this now to look also further to Central and Eastern Europe, Central Asia, the Caucasus, and the Black Sea region. So thank you very much to everyone, and I'm looking forward to see you next year in Vienna.
Andre, if I may, just before could we just say a special word of thanks to the Crown Prince, who's with us this morning, has been such a force in getting this meeting organized and in supporting it. And as always, you're so discreet about it that I'm not sure everybody here recognizes the role you've played, Prince Philip, in this. And thank you.
Thank you, Mark.